Beyond the camera's gaze and across the invisible lines of history lies the untold truth. Prepare to witness the extraordinary events and pivotal moments that fundamentally reshaped our modern world.
Ma'am, what are you doing in this establishment? The staff called about suspicious behavior. Why are you taking pictures?
I'm sorry?
I need you to leave the premises. You're making staff uncomfortable and customers have complained.
My son owns this restaurant, and he told me
Obstetric
to wait
provision.
for him.
Mitchell's Family Diner at 847 Peachtree Street in Atlanta had been Kendrick Daniels' dream for 15 years. The restaurant he'd built from nothing after working his way up from line cook to executive chef to owner. And on October 18, 2024, his mother, Patricia Daniels, was visiting from South Carolina to see it for the first time, taking photos of every detail with the pride only a mother could feel. But her presence triggered suspicion in a young server who saw a black woman moving around taking pictures rather than ordering food and called police instead of asking if she needed help. Officer Greg Stevens responded to the suspicious person call with his usual assumption that black people in white spaces were probably criminals. And when he arrived and saw Patricia taking photos near the kitchen entrance, he demanded she leave without gathering any information about why she was there. Patricia refused because her son had told her to wait for him inside, and Stevens's response to her refusal was to draw his service weapon and point it at a 62-year-old woman whose only crime was being proud of her son's restaurant. What Stevens didn't know was that Kendrick Daniels was parking his car outside at that moment, that he would walk in to see his mother with a gun pointed at her face in his own diner, and that his fury at what he witnessed would set in motion investigations, lawsuits, and consequences that would end Stevens's career and expose the racism that made a mother's pride look like criminal activity. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe that a mother's pride should never be mistaken for criminal activity, then hit the like and subscribe button here on JPTV. Patricia Daniels had been awake since 5 a.m., too excited to sleep properly in the hotel room she checked into the night before. She was 62 years old, a retired elementary school teacher from Charleston, South Carolina, and today she was finally going to see what her son had built. Kendrick had been telling her about Mitchell's Family Diner for 3 years, ever since he'd signed the lease and started the renovation, describing every detail over their weekly phone calls while she listened with the fierce pride only a mother could feel. She'd watched him work his way up through the restaurant industry for 15 years, starting as a line cook at a chain restaurant when he was 23, moving to better kitchens, learning from experienced chefs, eventually becoming an executive chef at a high-end restaurant in Buckhead. He'd saved every penny he could, lived in a tiny apartment, drove an old car, all so he could one day open his own place. Mitchell's Family Diner was named after her father, Kendrick's grandfather, who passed away 5 years ago after running a small breakfast spot in Charleston for 40 years. Kendrick wanted to honor that legacy with a modern take on classic comfort food, a place where families could eat good food at fair prices in a neighborhood that was rapidly gentrifying and pushing out the kind of restaurants working people could afford. Patricia had wanted to visit earlier, but her health hadn't allowed it. She'd been managing diabetes and high blood pressure, and the doctors had advised against travel until her medications were properly adjusted. But now she was stable, feeling good, and she'd driven 8 hours from Charleston to Atlanta specifically to see her son's dream realized in brick and mortar. She arrived at the diner at 11:52 a.m., 8 minutes before she was supposed to meet Kendrick. The building was exactly as he'd described it, a renovated storefront with large windows, a red and white striped awning, and a hand-painted sign that said Mitchell's Family Diner, in letters that reminded her of her father's old place. She stood outside for a moment just looking at it, feeling tears prick her eyes because this was her baby's restaurant, proof of 15 years of hard work and sacrifice. She took a photo of the exterior with her phone to send to her sisters back in Charleston. Her phone buzzed with a text from Kendrick. Running about 15 minutes late, had to stop for a produce delivery issue. Go inside and look around. Can't wait to show you everything. Patricia walked through the front door and stopped just inside, taking in the interior with wide eyes and a smile she couldn't suppress. The space was beautiful in its simplicity. The walls were painted a warm cream color with vintage family photos in mismatched frames, creating a cozy, welcoming atmosphere. The floor was classic black and white checkerboard tile. The counter had red vinyl stools, and the booths along the windows had the same red vinyl upholstery. The lunch crowd was light, maybe 6 or 7 customers scattered across tables and booths, the quiet murmur of conversation mixing with old soul music playing softly from speakers. Behind the counter, she could see into the kitchen where line cooks were working, and she felt another surge of pride knowing her son had built this, had created jobs, had made something real and lasting. She walked slowly through the dining area, looking at everything. She stopped to examine the menu board mounted on the wall: Mitchell's breakfast special, Grandpa's meatloaf, Southern fried chicken plate, classic burger and fries. All reasonably priced, all the kind of food her father had served. She took a photo of the menu. She moved to look at the photos on the wall, recognizing some of them from her own family albums that Kendrick must have copied: her father in his apron outside his old restaurant, family gatherings, Kendrick as a child helping in his grandfather's kitchen. She took photos of those too, wanting to document every detail. Near the kitchen entrance, she stopped to admire the open design that let customers see their food being prepared, a modern touch her father's place never had. She was taking a photo of the kitchen setup when she noticed one of the servers watching her with an expression that wasn't friendly or welcoming. Ashley Morgan was 24 years old and had been working at Mitchell's Family Diner for exactly 3 months. She was a college student working part-time to pay rent, and her interaction with the owner, Kendrick, had been minimal. He was usually there during morning setup and evening closing, not during her lunch shifts. She'd never met his family and knew nothing about his personal life. When Patricia had walked in, Ashley had noticed her immediately because she didn't sit down or approach the counter to order. Instead, she'd started walking around the dining area, looking at everything, taking photos with her phone. To Ashley's inexperienced eyes, this looked suspicious. Why would someone come into a restaurant and take pictures instead of eating? Why was she examining the layout, the kitchen entrance, the exits? Ashley had heard stories in training about people casing restaurants before robberies, about how thieves would come in during slow periods to photograph layouts and security cameras. The more she watched Patricia move around taking pictures, the more convinced she became that something wasn't right. She approached her coworker at the register and whispered, "That woman over there has been walking around taking pictures for like 10 minutes. She hasn't ordered anything or sat down. Should we say something?" The coworker glanced over at Patricia. "I don't know. Maybe she's waiting for someone? She's taking pictures of the kitchen and the exits. That's weird, right?" Ashley made a decision. Instead of approaching Patricia and asking if she needed help or was waiting for someone, she pulled out her phone and called 911, speaking quietly so the customers wouldn't hear. "I need to report a suspicious person at Mitchell's Family Diner on Peachtree Street. There's a black woman who came in about 10 minutes ago, and she's been walking around taking pictures of our restaurant. She's not eating or ordering anything, just taking photos of everything, including our kitchen. I think she might be casing the place." The dispatcher took down the information and said an officer would respond shortly. Officer Greg Stevens was 4 blocks away when the call came over his radio about a suspicious person at a diner on Peachtree. He was 43 years old, an 11-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, and his personnel file contained 14 complaints over those 11 years, all from black citizens alleging racial profiling, excessive force, or harassment during routine encounters. All 14 complaints had been investigated and dismissed as unsubstantiated or within officer discretion. Stevens had developed a pattern over his career of responding to calls in gentrifying neighborhoods with the assumption that black people didn't belong in those spaces, that their presence was inherently suspicious and probably criminal. He'd stop black shoppers in boutiques, black diners in upscale restaurants, black residents in their own apartment buildings, always with the same justification: someone had called about suspicious behavior, and he was investigating. When he heard black woman and taking pictures and casing the place, his 11 years of bias told him exactly what he'd find: someone planning a robbery or involved in some kind of criminal activity. He pulled up to the diner at 12:03 p.m. and walked through the front door with his hand already near his weapon. Patricia was near the front window looking at a framed photo of Kendrick's culinary school graduation when the door opened and the officer entered. She glanced at him briefly, assuming he was there for lunch, and returned her attention to the photo that showed her baby in his chef's whites accepting his diploma. Stephen scanned the diner and immediately spotted Patricia, well-dressed black woman in her 60s, phone in hand, standing near the window examining the walls. In his judgment, she fit the description and looked exactly like someone who didn't belong. He walked directly to her, his posture aggressive, his voice already carrying the edge of authority and suspicion. "Ma'am, what are you doing in this establishment?" Patricia turned, surprised by the tone. "I'm sorry?" "I said, what are you doing here? Staff called about suspicious behavior. Why are you taking pictures?" Patricia felt confusion mixed with the first stirrings of concern because this officer's tone suggested she'd done something wrong when all she'd done was admire her son's restaurant. "I'm waiting for someone. I'm allowed to be here." "Are you a paying customer? Did you order food?" "Not yet. I'm waiting for my son. He told me to come inside and look around." Stevens heard what sounded like an excuse, the kind of story people tell when confronted about behavior they know is wrong. "I need you to leave the premises. You're making staff uncomfortable and customers have complained." Patricia looked around at the 6 customers in the diner, none of whom looked uncomfortable or seemed to even notice her, except for the server who was watching from behind the counter. She looked back at Stevens with growing anger because she understood exactly what was happening here. "I'm not leaving. My son owns this restaurant, and he told me to wait for him here." And Greg Stevens, with 11 years of racist policing, telling him that a black woman claiming to own or be connected to a business in a gentrifying neighborhood was obviously lying, decided this situation required immediate control before it escalated further. Stevens looked at Patricia with obvious disbelief because in his 11 years of biased policing, he'd heard similar claims before, and they were always lies in his experience. "You expect me to believe you're related to the owner? That's convenient." Patricia felt her anger rising because this was exactly the kind of racism she'd experienced throughout her life. The automatic assumption that she was lying rather than telling a simple truth. "I don't expect anything from you. I'm telling you the facts. My son Kendrick Daniels owns this diner, and I'm waiting for him to arrive. You can verify that with the staff." Stevens glanced at Ashley behind the counter, and she shrugged because she didn't know who the owner's mother was or what she looked like. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to leave voluntarily or I'll have to remove you for trespassing." "I'm not trespassing in my son's restaurant. I have every right to be here." Other customers were starting to pay attention now, watching the confrontation unfold. Rebecca Chen, a regular who ate lunch at Mitchell's 3 times a week, pulled out her phone and started recording because something about this felt wrong. She'd seen Kendrick many times and knew he was black, and the idea that this well-dressed black woman might actually be his mother seemed far more likely than the officer's assumption she was lying. Stevens took a step closer to Patricia, his voice getting harder. "This is your last warning. Leave now or you'll be arrested for criminal trespassing and disorderly conduct." Patricia stood her ground because she'd raised her son to never back down from injustice, and she wasn't about to model different behavior now. "I'm calling my son right now to come verify who I am." She pulled out her phone and Stevens immediately moved forward, his hands shooting out to grab her wrist. "Don't reach for anything. Keep your hands where I can see them." Patricia jerked her hand back, shocked. "I'm calling my son. What is wrong with you?" "I said keep your hands visible. You're being aggressive and non-compliant." Patricia's voice rose because the absurdity and injustice of this moment was overwhelming. "I'm being aggressive? You're the one threatening to arrest me for waiting in my son's restaurant." Stevens felt his authority being challenged in front of witnesses, and his training told him that when citizens resisted, officers needed to establish control through force if necessary. But something in Patricia's demeanor, maybe the genuine indignation or the way other customers were watching and recording, made him hesitate on the physical contact. Instead, he made a decision that was somehow worse. He reached for his service weapon and drew it, pointing it directly at Patricia. "I need you to put your hands up and move toward the door right now." The diner went completely silent. Patricia froze, staring at the gun pointed at her chest, her hands slowly rising. She couldn't process what was happening because she'd been taking pictures of her son's restaurant 5 minutes ago, and now she had a weapon aimed at her. Rebecca Chen's phone captured everything. Ashley gasped behind the counter, realizing this had gone catastrophically wrong. The other customers sat frozen, some with forks halfway to their mouths. Stevens seemed to realize in that moment that he'd made a terrible error in judgment. You don't pull a gun on an elderly woman in a diner full of witnesses unless there's an immediate threat to life. And Patricia standing with her phone was obviously not that. He holstered the weapon quickly, but he'd already committed to removing her, and backing down now would look weak. I'm going to escort you out of this establishment. If you resist, I will arrest you. He grabbed Patricia's arm, his grip tight and controlling, and started pulling her toward the door. Patricia tried to pull away, not violently but firmly, repeating that she had the right to be there, that this was her son's restaurant. Let go of me! You have no right to do this! Stevens tightened his grip and used his other hand to grab her other arm, now physically dragging her across the floor while she resisted and protested. Her purse fell from her shoulder. Her phone clattered to the floor. She was being manhandled in front of strangers in her son's own diner, and the humiliation mixed with fear because this officer had already pointed a gun at her, and she didn't know how far he was willing to go. Rebecca was still recording, her narration quiet but clear. He just pulled a gun on her. Now he's dragging her out. This is Mitchell's diner. I think that might actually be Kendrick's mom. The door opened and Kendrick Daniels walked in, carrying a box of fresh produce, smiling because he was excited to finally show his mother everything he'd built. The smile died instantly when he saw his mother being dragged across his restaurant floor by a police officer, her face showing fear and humiliation, her belongings scattered on his checkered tile. For a moment, Kendrick couldn't process what he was seeing. Then the full reality hit him, and his rage was immediate and explosive. He dropped the produce box and rushed forward, shouting at Stevens to let her go, his voice carrying 15 years of protective love for his mother and fury at seeing her treated this way. Stevens released Patricia and turned to face this new person interfering with his actions, and Patricia stumbled backward, catching herself against a booth. Kendrick was between them now, his body language protective, his voice shaking with anger. That's my mother! What the hell are you doing to my mother in my restaurant? Stevens felt the situation slipping completely out of his control because this man was clearly the owner based on how he just claimed the space. And if he was telling the truth about being her son, then everything Stevens had just done was indefensible. Ashley spoke up from behind the counter, her voice small and guilty. Kendrick, I'm so sorry. I didn't know that was your mom. She was taking pictures, and I thought... Kendrick turned his fury on her too. You thought what? That a black woman taking pictures in a diner must be planning a crime? So instead of asking if she needed help, you called the cops? He turned back to Stevens, his anger reaching a peak that made his hands shake. And you pulled a gun on her. I saw you. Everyone saw you. You pointed a weapon at my mother. Rebecca held up her phone. I got it all recorded. He drew his weapon and pointed it right at her. Kendrick's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. You pulled a gun on a 62-year-old woman whose only crime was being proud of her son's restaurant, in my restaurant, and then you put your hands on her. Stevens tried to salvage something from the disaster unfolding around him. I was responding to a call about suspicious behavior. She refused to leave when ordered. Ordered? She doesn't take orders from you to leave her son's property? This is my diner. She was waiting for me like I told her to. Patricia had recovered enough to speak, her voice shaking with residual fear and anger. I told him you own this place. I told him I was waiting for you. He called me a liar and threatened to arrest me. Kendrick looked at his mother's face, saw the trauma there, saw her scattered belongings on his floor, and something hardened in him that would never soften again when it came to this officer in this moment. You're done. Your career is over. I'm calling your supervisor. I'm filing every complaint that exists, and I'm suing you personally and the department. You terrorized my mother in my restaurant because you couldn't imagine a black woman might actually belong here. And Greg Stevens, standing in Mitchell's family diner surrounded by witnesses and cameras, and the fury of a son who just watched his mother held at gunpoint, realized that his 11 years of getting away with racist policing had just ended in the worst possible way. Sergeant Raymond Torres arrived at the diner 12 minutes after Kendrick called 911 to report an officer assaulting his mother. Torres had worked with Kendrick before on community policing initiatives and knew him as a respected business owner who'd invested in a neighborhood struggling with gentrification. When he walked through the door and saw Stevens standing across from Kendrick with Patricia sitting in a booth being comforted by customers, his expression showed he already knew this was bad. "Kendrick, what happened here?" Kendrick's voice was controlled fury. "Your officer pulled a gun on my mother and then physically dragged her across my restaurant because a server called about suspicious behavior. The suspicious behavior was my mom taking pictures while waiting for me." Torres looked at Stevens. "You drew your weapon." Stevens tried to explain. "I responded to a suspicious person call. The subject was taking photos, refused to leave when ordered, and became aggressive when I attempted to escort her out." Rebecca Chen stepped forward with her phone. "That's a lie. I recorded the whole thing. He drew his weapon and pointed it at her when she tried to call her son. She wasn't aggressive. She was scared." Torres took Rebecca's phone and watched the video. The footage was damning and clear. It showed Patricia standing calmly with her phone, Stevens demanding she leave, Patricia explaining she was waiting for her son, Stevens drawing his weapon and pointing it at her chest. The audio captured Patricia's voice rising in fear, Stevens ordering her hands up, then holstering the weapon and grabbing her arms to drag her toward the door while she protested. Torres played it twice, his face getting harder with each viewing. He looked at Stevens. "Give me your badge and your weapon. You're suspended effective immediately." "Sarge, she was—" "I said give me your badge and weapon, now." Stevens removed his duty belt and badge with shaking hands, the reality of what he'd done finally sinking in. Torres turned to Patricia, who was still sitting in the booth with tears on her face and her hands trembling. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Torres. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Patricia shook her head, her voice unsteady. "I'm not hurt physically, but he pointed a gun at me, in my son's restaurant. I was just taking pictures." Torres pulled Stevens' personnel file on his phone and found exactly what he expected. 14 complaints over 11 years, all from black citizens, all alleging racial profiling or excessive force, all dismissed. He showed the summary to Kendrick. "Your officer has 14 complaints for this exact behavior, and nothing was ever done about it," Kendrick said, his voice cold. "So he kept doing it until he pulled a gun on someone's mother in front of witnesses." Torres couldn't defend it because the pattern was undeniable. He pulled up the dispatch call and listened to Ashley's report about a suspicious black woman taking pictures. He looked at Ashley, who was crying behind the counter. "Did you ask her if she needed help before calling police?" Ashley shook her head. "No, I just thought she looked suspicious." "She looked suspicious taking pictures in a restaurant? Or she looked suspicious because she was black and you made assumptions?" Ashley had no answer. Torres reviewed everything. The call itself was racially motivated, an employee seeing suspicious behavior where there was only a mother's pride. Stevens' response was excessive force without justification. The video showed him drawing a weapon on an unarmed elderly woman, then using physical force to remove her when she exercised her right to remain in her son's property. He pulled Patricia's information and found she was a retired school teacher with no criminal record, a respected community member in Charleston who'd driven 8 hours to see her son's business. He pulled Kendrick's business license and permits, confirming he'd owned the diner for 3 years, and it was successful and well-reviewed. "This is what happened," Torres said, laying it out with cold precision. Miss Patricia Daniels came to visit her son Kendrick's restaurant for the first time. She was taking photos because she was proud. An employee made a racially biased assumption and called police. Officer Stevens responded with 11 years of bias, telling him a black woman in this space must be lying about belonging here. He drew his weapon without cause. He used force without justification. He assaulted the owner's mother in the owner's own business, based purely on the color of her skin. Kendrick looked at Stevens. "You couldn't imagine my mother might actually have a reason to be here. You couldn't imagine a black woman taking pictures might be doing something innocent. So you pulled a gun on her." Stevens had no defense because the evidence destroyed every excuse. The bodycam Torres now had access to showed everything the customer video showed, plus Stevens's comments about her story being too convenient, and his refusal to verify with staff before escalating to force. Patricia stood up, her voice stronger now. "I'm a retired teacher. I spent 40 years educating children. I raised my son to work hard and build something meaningful. And today, the first time I see what he built, I get a gun pointed at my face because an officer decided I was a criminal for taking pictures of my son's success." Torres looked at the evidence, the witnesses, the video, the history, and knew exactly how this would end. Officer Stevens will be terminated and charged criminally for assault and excessive force. The department will fully cooperate with any civil lawsuit. And Ms. Daniels, I cannot apologize enough for what you experienced. But apologies couldn't erase the image of a gun pointed at her chest, couldn't restore the joy of seeing her son's restaurant for the first time, couldn't undo the trauma of being dragged across a floor while her son's employees watched. Stevens had destroyed all of that in 15 minutes because his racism was stronger than basic common sense. Greg Stevens was fired from the Atlanta Police Department within 72 hours of the incident, terminated before the internal investigation was even complete because the video evidence made his continued employment legally and morally indefensible. The footage of him drawing his weapon on Patricia Daniels in a crowded diner went viral within days, becoming national news as an example of how racial profiling can escalate from suspicion to deadly force in seconds over nothing more than a mother taking pictures. The criminal charges came swiftly. Stevens was indicted for assault, battery, unlawful use of force, and deprivation of civil rights. His defense attorney tried to argue he was responding reasonably to a suspicious person call, but the video destroyed that narrative completely. The jury watched Patricia explain calmly that she was waiting for her son, watched Stevens dismiss her explanation without verification, watched him draw his weapon when she reached for her phone. They convicted him after deliberating for 2 hours. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison with 3 years probation and permanent loss of his law enforcement certification. Ashley Morgan, the server who'd called police, was fired by Kendrick the same day because her assumption that a black woman taking pictures must be planning a crime rather than celebrating her son's achievement was exactly the kind of bias that gets people killed. Kendrick used the incident to completely retrain his staff on implicit bias in customer service, making it clear that calling police on customers should be an absolute last resort after exhausting every other option, including simply asking if someone needs help. The civil lawsuit Patricia filed was substantial. She sued Stevens personally and the Atlanta Police Department for the trauma of having a weapon pointed at her, being physically assaulted, and having her first visit to her son's restaurant turned into a nightmare. The city settled for $1.8 million, one of the largest settlements ever paid for a use of force incident that didn't result in physical injury. The settlement came with mandatory reforms including automatic review of all use of force incidents, tracking of officers with patterns of complaints, and immediate intervention when racial bias is evident. But the money couldn't restore what was taken. Patricia had driven 8 hours with joy and excitement to see her son's dream realized, and instead her first memory of Mitchell's family diner would forever be the moment a gun was pointed at her chest. She developed severe anxiety about being in public spaces, especially around police officers. She couldn't look at the photos she'd taken before Stevens arrived without remembering what came after. The pride she'd felt seeing her son's achievement was now mixed with trauma she couldn't separate from that place. Kendrick's relationship with his restaurant changed too. The diner he'd built as a tribute to his grandfather and a service to his community was now the place where his mother was terrorized. He couldn't walk through the front door without seeing her being dragged across the floor. Every time he saw the spot where she'd dropped her purse, where her phone had clattered to the tile, where she'd stood with her hands up facing a weapon, the joy of ownership was tainted by rage and helplessness. His trust in his employees was shattered. Ashley's call had been based on seeing a black woman and assuming criminality, and Kendrick had to live with the knowledge that he'd hired someone whose bias nearly got his mother killed. He implemented new policies, new training, new oversight, but he could never be certain it wouldn't happen again. The relationship between Mitchell's family diner and the police changed permanently. Officers who used to stop in for coffee were no longer welcome. Kendrick made it clear that the department's 11 years of ignoring Stevens's pattern had enabled what happened to his mother, and he wanted nothing to do with them beyond what the law required. 3 years later, Patricia still hadn't returned to Atlanta to visit the diner. She talked to Kendrick weekly, supported his business from afar, but she couldn't bring herself to walk through those doors again. The settlement money sat in accounts funding scholarships for hospitality students and community programs fighting racial profiling. But no amount of money could buy back the moment that was stolen. A mother's first proud look at her child's success, destroyed by an officer who saw her blackness as suspicious and her pride as criminal intent. Stevens served 14 months in prison and was released to a life where he'd never work in law enforcement again. His personnel file with 14 dismissed complaints became a case study in how departments enable racist officers by refusing to act on clear patterns. Patricia won her lawsuit and achieved policy changes, but the cost was permanent trauma and the loss of a memory she'd anticipated for 3 years. Kendrick continued running his restaurant successfully, but the joy was forever complicated by what happened there. He'd built Mitchell's Family Diner to honor his grandfather's legacy and serve his community, and an officer's racism had infected that space with violence and fear that no renovation or time could completely erase. The video of Patricia with her hands up, a gun pointed at her chest while she stood in her son's restaurant taking pictures of his menu board, became a symbol of how easily maternal pride can be mistaken for criminal activity when filtered through the lens of racism. Stevens lost everything and went to prison. Policies changed. The settlement was historic. But Patricia still couldn't visit her son's diner, and Kendrick still saw his mother's fear on that checkered tile floor every single day. A mother taking pictures of her son's restaurant, an employee who saw crime instead of pride, an officer who saw threat instead of family. 14 complaints ignored until a gun was drawn in a diner full of witnesses. Justice was served and changes were made, but some moments of terror can never be undone. If you believe assumptions should never replace questions, share this story. Subscribe to JPTV for stories where legal victories can't erase the trauma. Drop a comment. How do we stop pride from looking like suspicion? See you next time.
Behind every single piece of data lies a complex and fascinating narrative. And within every narrative, there is a hidden truth striving to be brought to light. We genuinely appreciate you being here to uncover it with us today.